here's the premise. To maximize the revenue, video producers must distribute to all available screens. And when we talk about multiple screens, we're looking at three basic categories. We're looking at computers, which I'll call desktops, which are basic Windows, Mac, and mobile and notebooks. And then we're looking at mobile, iOS, Android, and Windows Phone and some others. And then we're looking at over-the-top devices. And we'll take a closer look at what I mean by multiple screen delivery in a second. Couple of caveats, I guess more than a couple. It's a very complex, dynamic subject. So, it's hard to know what a fact is because tomorrow that fact could be totally different. I am not a programmer, so I'm going to talk about some programming things. I'm a journalist. I can research things. I have researched, so I think I'm accurate, but I'm not a programmer. Just wanted to say that. In some areas, we're not talking technology, we're talking religion. So if I say you can't do Dash easily on desktop, I could get stormed, I could get shot. I mean, we're moving to a point where it's getting emotional as opposed to just, what is the facts? And I'm trying to seek out the facts, but, I may get shouted at here today, and I want to, just talk about that up front and let you guys know it might be coming. And also, when there's a will, there's a way. So if you say, again, if I say you can't do something, I'm sure somebody can find a way that you can do it, however impractical that might be. So, and the last one, shockingly, I do not know everything. I have done a lot of research on this, and I'm trying to be complete, but if I miss something, just please let me know. And whatever I say here, you should trust it, but verify it, to use an old Reagan-era phrase. All that is caveats, where I think you may get some useful information, but I wanted to put this up front. I wanted to talk about different ways of approaching this. Okay, so we're looking at three platforms, and each platform offers a range of opportunities to get video playing on those platforms. And for the desktop, which is the upper left-hand corner, you can see desktop, you can have playback in the browser. And if you playback in the browser, you have, the penetration depends upon which browser it is, which technology. I mean, you can get HTTP live streaming in a browser, on a Mac, in Safari. So, it's technology dependent, browser dependent. HTML5 today for HTML5 playback is, depending on which source you trust, is anywhere between, say, 70% and 90% penetration. So there's no universality, even if you say it plays back in a browser, but some come pretty close. If you depend upon a plugin like Flash, obviously the penetration depends upon the plugin, right? So Flash is, again, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 90 to 98% in all browsers, even if they are HTML5 compatible. So Flash is a pretty good technology to rely on if you're trying to get to browser-based platforms on the desktop. You can use an off-the-shelf player, and when I say off-the-shelf player, I mean a player like JW Player that you kind of configure in. It's not something you develop your own. You just say, okay, here's the off-the-shelf player. I'll embed that into my web page just like you would embed a YouTube video, and that's fairly simple to do. And then there's custom player, where you can, with a custom player like YouTube does, they can design any technology they want. But if we look down, support in a browser costs you nothing, support in a plugin costs you nothing. So if you rely on Flash to reach desktops, you don't have to spend any money, you don't have to do any programming. It's very easy. If you use an off-the-shelf player, and I'm going to keep referring to JW Player because I have experience with that, there's a great article in Streaming Media by Robert Reinhardt a few months ago that talks about the 5 key or most pervasive off-the-shelf players. So if you want more information about the off-the-shelf players, you can check that article. Off-the-shelf player, again, the cost is $300 and the complexity is minimal. It really is as simple as pasting in an embed code into a web page, and we've all done that for YouTube. So you don't have to be a programmer to implement it. If you build a custom player, you need big dollars, and that, who knows what that can amount to. How much has YouTube invested in developing in their player? I mean, who knows, but it's easily millions. And obviously you need a programmer. So whenever you look at any of these approaches, you have to look at multiple aspects of it. And the bottom line is, not the bottom line, ultimate bottom line, but the bottom line here is that, however you do this, you get increasing benefits if you're willing to spend the money. So YouTube gets tremendous control over their player. If they want to use Dash in their player, if they want to use HLS, they can do that because they're spending the bucks to do that. If you have the bucks, that's great. If you have the need, that's great. But if you don't, you can play back in a browser and you just get basic functionality. Okay, so there's more than one way, and this will come into play later on in the discussion. And then if you're looking at mobile, there's two ways to reach mobile. You can do it native in a browser. So if you're sending video to an Apple device, they play a technology called HTTP live streaming, an adaptive bitrate technology. It's required if you want to include video playback in an app in the App Store. And it's native to the platform. It doesn't cost you anything. It's very easy to implement. And the features are functional but basic. So you can get support natively in the operating system, or you can create an app. And if you want to create an app, again, you're spending a lot of money to create that app, and who knows what that cost could amount to. The complexity is you need a programmer to do that for you, but then the features become completely custom. If you want to build an app, you can play back, Flash on an iOS or an Android platform. You can play back smooth streaming. You can play back Dash. You can play back any technology you want, but you got to spend the money. Okay, so for mobile, it's either native or app. And then retail OTT, when I'm saying retail OTT, I mean retail devices that we can buy, Chromecast, Apple TV, Roku, boxes like that. And again, you have native formats that they support. So they all support HLS, HTTP live streaming. But, and I'm not 100% clear on this, but it's possible that if you wanted to use Dash on a Roku, or certainly Chromecast supports Dash as well. And I'm going to cover all what Dash is and all these platforms later. I'm just trying to set up a structure for the discussion. If you want to create a totally custom app, you can support more formats than might be supported natively in each of these devices. So you get more flexibility, but you spend money for it. Okay, and I just wanted to set that up. There's more than one way to approach all of these platforms. And we talk about multiple screen delivery, and we kind of deal with it with a very broad brush, right? Is we all want to be on multiple screens. The issue is, as you climb this pyramid, the number of viewers decrease. So everybody wants to be on computers, everybody wants to be on mobile. Retail OTT, again, that's Roku, Chromecast, Apple TV. Smart TV, that's the Samsungs. It's a smaller platform, but it's a growing platform. Different technologies are at play. And then OEM OTT, this is the set-top boxes, that are coming in and broadcast in different places. These are the ones that are starting to do H.265. These are not retail. These are ones that, an OTT provider would install in your home. Okay, so, and along the way, we're going to be looking at which chunks you really want to access. So you come to this session, you want multiple screen delivery. How multiple screen do you want it to be? Do you really want to get all the way up to the tippy top? Because if you do, it's going to cost a lot more, and the number of viewers that you're going to access decreases. So the cost per viewer really goes up because it costs more to access them, and the number that you're accessing goes down. So I had a very fortunate discussion yesterday with somebody who was looking at this very problem. If you're distributing free video, how much do you want to spend to get to the tippy top? And we're going to come back to this pyramid again and again and again during the course of the discussion. Okay, so rule number one is actually, it's use H.264. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but So if you're doing multiple screen delivery, maybe I'm flashing forward to 2018 or something, but rule number one is use H.264. And let me say at this point, this presentation will be up on my website, Streaming Learning Center, by the end of the day, and it'll be up on Streaming Media probably in the next couple of days. So this will be fixed. But if you can kind of mark it out in your mind, H.264. So if you want to access all multiple screens today, it's use H.264. It's a high-quality compression technology. Plays pretty much everywhere in a bunch of different ways. Flash, QuickTime Silverlight. Plays in most HTML5 browsers, except for Firefox and Opera. Plays natively on all mobile devices and all OTT devices. So if you're going to encode for multiple screen delivery, rule number one, use H.264. The thing you need to know about H.264 is that from a compatibility perspective, meaning where will the file you create play, the most important characteristic that you need to configure in is the profile. So there's three profiles. There's baseline, main, and high. And this is a control you will see on pretty much every encoding tool that you use for any kind of encoding of H.264 files. So what is an H.264 profile? This is from Wikipedia. And it defines a set of coding tools or algorithms that can be used to generate a bit stream. So on the left, we have the coding tools and algorithms. And on the right, we have the four profiles. We only use three of those. We use baseline, main, and high. And as you see, the high profile uses more advanced tools. And the baseline profile used fewer advanced tools. So you would immediately conclude from this that the high would create a higher quality file, but that file might be harder to play back, okay? And we'll look at that particular assumption in a moment, but this is what profiles are. And why do profiles exist? Profiles exist because they allow device developers to use low-power CPUs to just play back a low requirement profile. So the original iPod came out with video. Apple said, you know, we need to minimize the cost of the CPU, so we're going to have a low-power CPU that can't play back the high profile, but it can play back the baseline profile. So Apple made that decision, and then they publicized to all the people who wanted to develop video for an iPod. And if you were producing video for an iPod, you had to produce using the baseline profile. So it's a nice meeting point between the hardware developer and the video developer. You know, you check any Apple specification, you can see that, you know, a device will play a particular profile at a particular level, and we'll see what a level is in a moment. So rule number two, don't exceed the profile of the target device. And at this point, target profile is only an issue with mobile devices, and really it's only an issue with older mobile devices. So computers can play high profile, all OTT devices can play high profile. So you never really need to worry about profile except when you're encoding for mobile. And this is a playback chart for Apple devices. Apple does a really wonderful job telling you what formats and what profiles their devices will play back. There's basically four categories here. The original video-capable iPod, which you can really only access via iTunes, right? It's not connected in a live way, so you can't stream to it. That will only play 320 by 240 files, baseline, profile level 1.3. We'll cover what a level is in a second. And then the next category is iPhones up to version 4, and that also accepts only files encoded using the baseline profile. So if you care about phones before the iPhone 4, you're going to need to use the baseline profile. Next level up in the blue is iPhone 4, iPod Touch 4. You can then use files encoded to the main profile, and once you get beyond that in the red, those are higher formats than you'd ever want to stream. You know, you might go high profile at 1080p, but you're probably not going to get to 50 megabits per second or 62 megabits per second. Certainly not for streaming. You may do that for iTunes, but you certainly aren't going to do that for streaming. So these are the specs for iDevices. And again, this will be available for download at streaminglearningcenter.com by the end of the day, so don't feel you need to, the only thing you need to write down is Streaming Learning Center, not any of this detail. So if you're encoding for iDevices, this is the chart you really care about. If you're encoding for Android, you don't get that level of specificity because Google isn't making all the hardware devices. So what Google says is, there's a bunch of hardware devices out there. We really don't know what they play. But if you really want every file you produce to play on every current Android phone, you need to produce using the baseline profile. So it's almost certain that most Android devices will play higher quality files than this. But Google can't guarantee that because they're not making the devices. So all they say is use the baseline profile for 100% guaranteed compatibility. And then you have to decide, well, are they lying or not lying? Bad word. I mean, can I be more aggressive or not? That's your decision as a developer. And then here's the required profiles for the Windows Phone. How many people are starting to care about the Windows Phone? Okay, I mean, I think their market share is growing. So I think it's increasingly relevant. If you look at their specs, which are included in the bit.ly link above the chart, they say, again, we have multiple CPUs being used for Windows Phone development. The 7x27A is the lowest common denominator. So if you want to play on all phones, you got to use these specs here, and they can play files up to baseline or up to the high profile if you limit the resolution to 800 by 480 at 4 megabits per second. So again, if you want your files to play, these are the configurations that you have to adhere your files to play back on these platforms. So the first decision you have to make is, do you create one set of files that are all baseline that play everywhere? So theoretically, you're going to create, say you've got a 640 by 480 file, you want it to play on computers, you want it to play on OTT devices, you want it to play on mobile devices. Do you create two files, one baseline for mobile and then one high profile for computers to get the maximum quality, or you just do all baseline so that you'll play everywhere with one file? One approach might maximize quality at the cost of administration and encoding. The other one is a simpler approach that creates one file to play back everywhere. And obviously the question is, how much difference did the different profiles make in terms of quality? So what I did, the recommendations I like to refer to most often when I'm looking at adaptive streaming and some of the tests that I do are Apple recommendations contained in Technical Note 2224, and this is where Apple sets up, this is Apple's recommended schema for encoding for delivery to the multiple screens that they offer. And they've done the most work in terms of setting this up and making it easy to follow and easy to understand, so I refer to them pretty often. And you see the multiple streams presented, and I ran some tests and I said, okay, what's the difference in quality at the three lowest streams? So if I encoded them using the baseline profile, what did they look like? If I encoded them using the high profile, what would they look like? And if they look the same, then you might as well just use one set of streams with the baseline profile, because you're going to save encoding costs, you're going to save administration costs. If they look vastly different, then you want to use one file for desktop and OTT and then one file for mobile for compatibility. So everybody clear on this and what the test is designed to show? And again, this is the handouts will be in color. You'll be able to look at this by this evening. But in the 416 by 234p, the high is on top, the baseline is on the bottom. I didn't see a lot of difference in terms of quality there. At 480 by 270, I didn't see a lot of quality difference here. And this is a pretty tough frame to decode. The ballerina is panning across the stage. This has tripped up many an encoder and many a codec. but the quality difference, is minimal in this case. And 640 by 360 at 600 kilobits per second, same frame. Again, you're seeing very little difference in quality between the frames. Okay, so the big question you have to ask yourself is, if you're encoding for multiple screens, do you want to create one baseline file for low-end mobile, one high-profile file for computer and OTT playback? And generally, I don't see the necessity to do that. If you look at some of the bigger companies, they do. I think increasingly a lot of the producers who are making files for multiple screen delivery are starting to use baseline profile for the low-end files, and then transitioning up to the high and the main profiles for their higher-end files. One set makes things very, very, very simple, and we'll see why in a few minutes when we talk about transmuxing and that kind of technology. Okay. So the key takeaway here for rule number 3 is don't assume you need custom groups. Don't assume that you need to create different files for each platform that you're targeting. Okay, and what are H.264 levels? Again, looking to Wikipedia, levels constrain key parameters in the bit stream. So what that means is that each profile is divided up into different levels, and that controls things like data rate, that controls things like resolution. When you're encoding for devices, you need to not only care about the profile, you need to care about the level for that particular device. And if you think back to the chart we saw in iOS, each section had the level that you couldn't exceed in that chart. So again, if you're producing for mobile devices, you can't exceed the levels of the target device. For computers and OTT, it's never a concern because they can play any profile, any level. Okay, so that's kind of the basics. And now let's look at different approaches for multiple screen delivery. So if you want to send a single file, not an adaptive group of files, if you want to send a single file to mobile and computers, the area outlined in red on the bottom, you can reach pretty much all computers and all mobile devices. And if you can encode in FFmpeg or in Handbrake and create your own HTML code, you can do this for free. Okay, so you don't have to spend any money at all. If you buy Sorensen Squeeze for $549, the complexity is minimal. They will create the required HTML for you, and you get all computers and all mobile devices. So what is flash fallback? Flash fallback, and you'll see what the code looks like in a second. It basically presents the HTML5 video tag first. If the browser can play the video using the video tag, it will play that. If it can't, it will fall back to Flash and play the file that way. Mobile devices all play H.264 with HTML5 coding, so those files will play automatically. And this is what it looks like from, and this is code created by Sorensen Squeeze. They're the only tool I'm aware of that can actually create both, the WebM and the H.264 file and create the HTML code for you. And what you're seeing is the video tag is on top. The video tag is, is what HTML5 does. That says, hey, can you play this file? Then the source file is H.264. That's the MP4 file. The WebM file is next. And then flash fallback is next. Okay, so this you embed this into your browser to play the file, and if it's an HTML5 compatible browser, it will play one of the two files, either H.264 or WebM. If not, it'll play back to Flash. And mobile devices will ignore the Flash and just play the H.264 file. Okay, and the reason I keep mentioning Sorensen Squeeze is because they can create both the WebM file and the H.264 file, and they can produce the HTML code for you. So it's very, very, very simple. And there's a tutorial up on the Streaming Media website that you can you can look at the bit.ly address at the bottom. And then here's what it looks like in Sarge and Squeeze. Very, very easy, very usable approach. So what don't you get if you implement that approach? We see that it's free. We see that it's easy. But what you don't get is you get progressive download instead of true streaming. So if you're distributing massive amounts of files, you're going to get a lot of distribution inefficiencies. You'll pay more than you have to for bandwidth. You're not getting adaptive streaming. You're getting single file delivery. You're not getting closed captions. You're not getting DRM, and you're not getting reach. You're only getting the two bottom rungs on that pyramid. So it's cheap, it's easy, but you lose all these options. So adaptive streaming, I think, is the best way to target a range of viewers. Today, everybody wants mobile. Everybody wants living room PCs with wonderful experiences. You can't send one file to both, so you want to use adaptive streaming. So now we're going to talk about what adaptive streaming is, look at the alternatives, and look at implementing two of those, HLS and Dash. And Dash this is where I get worried about getting things thrown at me. But let's dive in. So what is adaptive streaming? Adaptive streaming is one stream in, multiple streams out. And the streams are switched transparently to adapt to changing conditions like delivery bandwidths. If I'm watching Netflix and my daughter starts watching a YouTube video, the bandwidth in my house drops and Netflix will drop to a lower speed to keep the connection going. If all of a sudden I'm watching a video and I start encoding a file and my CPU utilization starts to get too high and I start dropping frames, the adaptive streaming system will send a lower stream so I avoid frame drops. So one stream in, multiple streams out, customized delivery based upon the playback capabilities and the bandwidth of the target device. And the key benefit is you're matching the quality to the delivery capabilities and the playback capabilities. So you get a really big file on an OTT device, and you get a really small file on a mobile device. Everybody gets the optimal experience for their viewing capabilities. Everybody walks away happy. Okay, so there's two types of systems. Server-based, which is Flash RTMP, and then there's HTTP-based systems. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these systems. I'm really going to look at the implementation details. But the technologies we spend our most time talking about are HTTP live streaming. Why is that important? That's important because that's the only way to natively stream to Apple devices. And it's the only way to stream to applications sold in the App Store. So if you're streaming to Apple devices, you need to care about HLS. Smooth streaming, not so important. That was Microsoft's delivery technology for Silverlight. It's also what they're using, at least initially, in their Azure media platform. They're starting to transition over to Dash. But smooth streaming is kind of a legacy format. Microsoft is not pushing that. They're moving forward to Dash pretty quickly. HTTP-based dynamic streaming is HTTP technology for Flash from Adobe, and dynamic adaptive streaming over HTTP or Dash is the standard for adaptive delivery to a range of different platforms. Who here hasn't heard of Dash? Anybody? Okay, I'm sure there's some, but at this point, most of these technologies should be reasonably familiar to most people. Okay, so there's a lot of pluses and minuses each technology have. There's a lot of pluses and minuses on the RTMP versus HTTP. But what I really tried to focus on here is, what does it take to deploy the technology? What do you have to do to deploy it? What's the cost? So if you look at Flash-based RTMP, on a desktop, you get that with Flash. No cost, no development. You just create your files and send it out, and Flash will play it. And it's green because it means it's easy, not because it requires a lot of money. The red says this is a problem because it does require a lot of money. So if you wanted to implement Flash on the desktop, it's very cheap and easy, but you require an app for iOS, an app for Android, an app for Windows Phone, and an app for retail OTT if it's possible at all. So if you If you wanted to implement Flash versus RTMP, you could on at least the first 4 platforms, but you would have to build apps for iOS, Android, and Win Phone. HLS, if you use an off-the-shelf player called the JW player, you can play HLS streams on a desktop that's got Flash installed. So that will cost you $300. We'll look at that in a second. So it's not as green as native playback, but it is pretty easy to implement, and it is a pretty inexpensive approach. HLS plays natively on the iOS platform, so you don't have to build an app for that. HLS plays on some Android devices, but it plays so poorly on most devices that most people just use a single RTSP stream to Android because there's no way to get reliable HLS playback. Win Phone, you need to do an app. Retail OTT devices, most of them support HLS natively. So you have to build an app, but you don't have to re-encode your streams. It's the most efficient way to reach Roku. Chromecast obviously accepts Dash as well, but it also accepts HLS. And obviously Apple TV accepts HLS natively. Smooth streaming. If you have the Silverlight plugin, you can play back smooth streaming on the desktop. If you have the Flash plugin with an if you have Flash with an OSMF plugin from Microsoft, you can also play back smooth streaming on the desktop. But you need an app for iOS, Android, and Win Phone. And I think there's one device that can play back. I think Roku can also do smooth streaming natively, but most of the others would require some kind of native technology stream adjustment. Flash HDS is the same as Flash RTMP, and then the bottom is Dash. So you can play Dash on the desktop. Some desktops, this is parts where it's unclear. Some solutions require the media source extensions, which is only IE11 and Chrome. It's not Firefox, it's not Safari. But again, I'm sure that when there's a will, there's a way. Somebody could find a way to play back Dash on the desktop today if you had enough money to be able to develop for it. If you want to play back an iOS, Android, or Win Phone, you're going to need an app. It's unclear. I got an email message from an Adobe developer who said that it's unclear whether Apple will approve any apps that require Dash for playback. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that was a question that someone raised to me. And then I also want to point out that Android 4.4, which is 8.5% of the Android market at this point, plays back Dash natively. So you can play Dash natively in Android, but it's only 8.5% of that market. Otherwise, you have to create an app that does Dash and extends that to the entire universe of Android players. So which alternative is easiest? Well, that's where the color coding comes in. The HLS, a lot more green than anywhere else, and I think that's the easiest approach. So let's look at that. I think very few people are trying to implement smooth across all these platforms. Very few people are trying to implement Flash on all these platforms. I think most people are either doing HLS or they're looking at Dash. And we'll talk about transmuxing in a few minutes. They're either doing Flash for desktop and HLS for everything else. But people who are trying to implement one technology for all these devices, 95% of them are using either HLS for all of them or they're looking to Dash. Okay, so this is alternative 2, adaptive streaming to desktop and mobile. Use HLS with the off-the-shelf player, and JW player is the player that I've used, and I've done this, so I know this works. I'm not saying it's the only player that does this, but it is a pretty well-known player, and it's well-known for this capability. What's the benefit of this approach? The benefit is the red square expands to cover computers, mobile, and all retail OTT devices. So again, you're going to have to build the channel, but the files that you encode should play on all these retail OTT boxes. And again, the cost of this, you can do this with Apple Compressor. It will create the HLS files for you, so the cost is $49, very inexpensive, and the JW player will cost you $300. So for $350, you get adaptive streaming to computers, mobile devices, and retail OTT with minimal complexity beyond the channels that you have to create for the OTT devices, but you're going to have to do that anyway. And the complexity is minimal. So this is something I can do. You know, if you can paste and embed code, you can implement this solution. And what don't you get? You don't get to reach the tippy top tiers, right? You're not reaching the two top tiers of smart TVs and OEM OTTs. So that's what you're missing out on, and you're losing out on some customizability. You know, customizability relating to DRM, customizability relating to closed captions. But, you know, again, for $350, if you've got a general purpose website, you don't care about captioning, you don't care about DRM, this is a pretty good solution. Okay, so my take on Dash. You know, I think Dash is clearly the future. I think there are some factors that are holding it up. Probably most importantly is Adobe is implementing Dash in prime time, which is their premium distribution platform. They're not implementing it in the basic Flash player. So I think if Adobe wanted to make our lives easier, they would just say, and they could do this tomorrow, we're going to start to support Dash playback in the general Flash player. 3 months later, 98% of the computers out there have Dash support, and all of a sudden we could just default to that for computer playback. What we're seeing is that, you know, Flash used to be the strategic jewel in Adobe's crown. They wanted it to be the most advanced technology because they were fighting Silverlight, and it was kind of the forefront of their digital media initiative. And now it's, you know, that Flash is almost like smoking cigarettes these days. You know, it's like, what, you use Flash? So what they're doing is that, you know, it's kind of, they're changing it from this strategic jewel to this cash cow. And they're saying, we're going to put everything in prime time because we can charge for it, and we want to make money from this. And I'm not, you know, I think that's probably a good move for them because, you know, they are a public corporation. But it is keeping Dash from general purpose usage, and they're going to take the same approach with H.265 playback, which means it's going to be very hard for H.265 to be implemented over the next 12 to 18 months. So I'm not saying what Adobe should or shouldn't do. I'm saying because they're not including Dash playback in Flash as opposed to primetime, they're really slowing the implementation of Dash in the general marketplace. And then Apple, we'll look at that in a second. You know, Apple is the second, if not even more important than Adobe. They're very critical to Dash's lack of overall momentum, and the third area of concern is legacy mobile. I think at this point, I don't know how many of these older mobile phones will be able to play Dash. So even if Adobe implemented Dash tomorrow and Apple said we're going to support it in all future phones, we're going to be supporting multiple platforms with different technologies, I think, for many years going forward. So I think it's interesting, you know, why is Apple being so quiet on their Dash support? I think if you looked at how HLS got pervasive, you know, Apple was first with the smartphone. They came out with a very progressive technology for distributing adaptive streaming. Their platform was so successful that everybody had to support it. So YouTube couldn't distribute videos to the Apple platform without supporting it. They wanted to get on the Apple platform. Netflix, same thing. Everybody had to support playback on Apple. Apple presented a very easy way to do it, so everybody started supporting HLS. And everybody, including the content people, and also alternative platforms. Android says, well, Adobe yanked Flash, can't use that. What do? Well, let's support HLS, and we'll play back all the content that's already encoded in HLS. And Roku said the same thing. Why create a different standard? Let's just use what Apple does. So Apple created this platform. They created this technology. It was so successful that everybody had to adopt it. So what's going to have to happen with Dash, I think, is that it's going to have to be forced on Apple. Apple's, you know, it's a strategic advantage to own the adaptive streaming technology. Why would they just give up an adaptive streaming technology? So we're going to look at reasons why Netflix and YouTube and other companies want to use Dash in a few minutes, but you know, in the foreseeable future, we're going to see a lot of people implementing Dash on the outside. So broadcast OTT devices will increasingly use Dash. Android already accepts Dash. YouTube uses Dash. Netflix uses Dash. And all of a sudden, all these outside forces are going to be pressing on Apple saying, you know, you need to support Dash too. And if you read some of the articles on, you know, why does Netflix think Apple will someday support Dash? Because they think that the iOS experience could degrade from a quality of service standpoint because there's so much cached content out there in Dash format and so little in HLS format that people using iOS devices will get a lower quality of experience than they would if they were using a Dash-supported device. Now, I don't see that anytime soon. I mean, you'd have to be absolutely nuts to stop supporting an iOS device at this point. And that's not going to change, I mean, 3 years, 4 years. So it really is kind of Apple's ball to play. But, you know, this is how I see Dash developing over the next few years. It's going to be a lot of people on the periphery implementing Dash, and then those market forces may try and convince Apple to support it. But again, Apple may have a reason to support Dash going forward, but I don't think it'll be because the market wants them to. I think it'll be because it makes sense for them. So who's using Dash today and why? Well, who's using Dash? Companies with R&D budgets larger than yours. And that includes, you know, YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, and they're doing this directly. And I think if you look at some of the major platforms, you know, Primetime is the Adobe premium distribution platform I talked about a moment ago. Microsoft Azure is moving towards Dash. You know, why are they moving towards Dash? Number one, you know, if you read the articles about what Netflix is doing and why, and what Hulu is doing why, and YouTube as well, it gives them greater reach. So a lot of the newer smart TV platforms are starting to implement Dash. A lot of the commercial OTT boxes, not the retail ones, are starting to use Dash. So if you use Dash, you can access the tippy top of the pyramid. And if you're Netflix and you're getting $9 a user, you know, it might make sense to do so. If you're Hulu and you're getting $8 a month per user, it might make sense to do so as well. Particularly if you've got millions and millions of users that amortize the development cost. So they're doing it because they want the greater reach. They want one common format for a range of deployments. You know, they want to use different formats each time they deploy the technology, and they want access to common encryption and formats to make it easier to preserve their content. So that's who's using Dash today and why. And the benefit is, again, you know, the square now encompasses all targets, so you get access to all the, you know, all of the devices in the multiple screen continuum. But it's going to cost you. It's either you're going to have to develop your own custom players and your own apps. You know, if you're rolling it yourself, that's what YouTube's doing, that's what Netflix is doing, that's what Hulu's doing. If you don't want to undertake that development platform, you can use Primetime and Azure to kind of get you to the same place. The reach is everywhere. The cost, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. And then the complexity is very, very significant. Okay? So we've kind of transitioned from, you know, free gives you single file playback to the bottom two tiers, to $350 gets you adaptive streaming to the top or the bottom three tiers, to spend a whole lot of money, you reach everybody. But it's a lot of complexity and a lot of cost involved. The bottom line is today, you know, so all this is looking into the future to a degree. Today, there's a really good chance you're going to have to support multiple formats. You know, I think probably 90% of the people out there who are supporting multiple platforms are supporting both Flash on the desktop and HLS for mobile and some OTT devices. How are they doing that? Are they encoding two sets of files? The answer is sometimes yes, but in most cases they're using a technology called transmuxing. So the historical perspective, the story I always tell is, 4 years ago now, Turner Broadcasting produced the PGA Championship, the fourth major of the year. They streamed to both flash devices on the desktop and iOS devices. And how they did that is they had two separate banks of encoders, one for flash, one for iOS, and then they sent out the two streams independently. A year later, they created one set of streams. They sent that to Akamai, and Akamai used their transmuxing technology to take the flash streams in, change the file header to conform it to the container format requirements for HLS, and then sent two sets of streams out. So they didn't re-encode, they just changed the container format. And that's what transmuxing is. It's very easy for the server to do, can do it in real time. There's a lot of different technologies that can do it. Probably the technology that pioneered it was Wowza. Wowza can do it. Adobe can do it. Microsoft can do it with IIS. Akamai can do it. There's a lot of technologies for doing it. And the key benefit is you don't have to encode multiple sets of streams. And you basically just send an RTMP stream to Wowza Media Server or Flash Media Server, and they will create the container format manifest files required for HLS delivery or any other format that you want. And Real Networks has a solution, their Helix Universal Server. Again, one stream in, multiple formats out. The key point about transmuxing, and this goes back to what we looked at 30 minutes ago, do you create two separate sets of files, one using the baseline profile, one using the high profile? If you want to transmux, obviously you need to be comfortable with using one set of files. And other than that, it's pretty simple to do in any of the servers that I talked about. And then here's kind of the bottom line. I think most mom and pop websites, most smaller websites that are not doing adaptive streaming, I think they should use HTML5 with Flash fallback. I think the next level up from a cost complexity standpoint, if you want to serve adaptively, I would use the HLS everywhere approach where I create one set of files with compressor or Sorensen squeeze, and then use the JW player to send that to both desktops and mobile devices. I think the transmux solution is pretty simple, but it's also more technically complex and it's more expensive. But I think most of the bigger sites at this point are taking that approach. And I think if you're at the very, very tip of the pyramid, if you're Netflix, if you're YouTube, if you're Hulu, that's where you really need to start thinking about Dash. Any questions?
You mentioned a few times the Microsoft Dash moving towards Dash implementation. It seems that the Dash complexity is mostly on the client side, not necessarily creation of content. So are they putting development time into client development for Dash?
Yeah, big time. So the question was, is Microsoft putting development time into player development for Dash? And I think yes. I mean, I think they're trying to put smooth in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible. And it's a major initiative. So there's a couple of articles, might even be front page of Streaming Media today, that's talking about what Microsoft is doing. But if you Googled Microsoft Dash and Streaming Media, you'd find 2 or 3 articles that talk about that.
Do you see Dash developing as a standard as it is today, or fragmenting to a de facto standard?
I'm sorry, a little bit louder, please.
Do you see MPEG Dash existing as a standard today that all developers will support, or fragmenting to a de facto standard? And to explain that, I mean, if you look at some of the encryption techniques, there was forced to support 5 approaches. Essentially, each individual DRM builders that were using them. It's
So the question is, how do I see Dash developing going forward as either, a real standard that everybody adopts universally, or kind of a clumps of de facto standards? To go back to a couple of the, probably won't be able to find it. So, I mean, you almost have to look at it in the individual spaces. So I think, what's going to happen in the computer space is really going to be dependent on what the browsers support, and that's 2 or 3 years away for universal browser support, and what Adobe does with Flash. I mean, they really could transform the market tomorrow if they just implemented Dash. And then the mobile space, that's obviously going to depend on what the different devices do. And then OTT, it's kind of the same thing. So it's really, 5 years ago, all we cared about was Flash. Today, it's just entirely different. So I really think it's gonna be a bunch of individual silos, and I think we're going to be transmuxing for a long time to come.
I'm not sure if this is a thing, but we talked about everything that the developers are doing to encode their content. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on the device side? Is there a lot of transcoding going on for a lot of the disparate files that are being streamed across the net? What kind of containers are being used on the device side? And if there is there a movement to some sort of prevailing container transcoding that's going on the device side?
So are you asking if devices are transcoding while they're playing, or?
Yes, and what codecs or what they may be using to be transcoding on the device side. In other words, is there I'm assuming that at one time there was a wild west of formats, and there still is, since a lot of devices still capture video in a lot of different formats, a lot of different video formats. And to play them back on these variety of devices, there had been, at least at some point, this device will play this back, and some devices will only play that back. So is there still a lot of that going on, or has things sort of simmered down to a certain extent in terms of what codecs those devices can read, or is there still a lot of disparate container formats that devices have to account for?
Okay, so what container formats and codecs are devices playing? I'm not going to address the capture side. That's a little bit different, but all devices play H.264, and the container format discussion is kind of what I talked about with HLS. So that's going to be device specific, but Apple plays back HLS, that's a particular container format. Android plays back HLS poorly, and has also started to adapt Dash in 4.4. Microsoft Windows phones, they support smooth streaming, which is even a third container format. But I don't think anybody's transcoding on the fly. I think they just decode. Okay, so the question is transmuxing occurring in real time, and are there scalability issues relating to that? The answer is yes, it is occurring in real time, and I think it's such a simple process that there are very few scalabilities that people, or very few scalability issues that people are running into. I think that's being done fairly consistently across most platforms that do it. In fact, a lot of technologies are starting to move to live transcoding, where they're taking in a single stream, encoding that into multiple streams, and then transmuxing those as necessary for the different target platforms. And I think even that's being done pretty routinely without any kind of scalability issues. But I think transmuxing is such a simple process that it really doesn't put that much additional requirement on the server. Well, so is there a difference with the VOD? Good question. I know I think each server technology deals with that a little bit differently. I think some, you store the file in RTMP format, and if an HLS device wants to play it, it'll do the transmux on the fly. And I think some may store the two different formats independently, but I'm not 100% clear on that. You'd have to. WOWS is here. I would just ask them. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks for your attention.